Europe has just over 25 years to reach its goal of net zero carbon emissions. The good news is that it seems to be on track to do just that. But will that mean the end of extreme weather events the region's been seeing lately? Hello and welcome to Roundtable. I'm Enda Brady. Now, 2024 is expected to be the hottest year on record. The planet needs countries to make good on promises to drastically lower greenhouse gas emissions. So, are we likely to reach that all-important 2050 target?
These wind turbines and solar panels are a big reason the EU is on target to reach its net zero goal. Emissions fell by a steep 15.5% in 2023. Increased renewable energy is part of the story. Arguably more important is the EU's emissions trading system. This requires polluting sectors to pay for every tonne of CO2 they emit. The current price is $75 per tonne. These sectors are not emitting as much carbon dioxide. As is often the case with policy changes, money talks. And these are make-or-break years for the planet.
We are living through climate collapse in real time, and the impact is devastating. This year has seen communities around the world pounded by fires, floods, and searing temperatures.
Greenhouse gases trap heat in the Earth's atmosphere, causing temperatures to rise. This means water also gets warmer, affecting water and wind cycles, and increases extreme weather events.
1 degree of global average temperature warming leads to about 7% increase in the amount of moisture that the atmosphere holds. And that means when it rains, we get heavier rainfall, deluges of rain that lead to flooding. And we're seeing more of these events being played out around the world.
So if it feels hotter, drier, rainier, that's because it is. What more can be done to keep global warming to a minimum and stave off even worsening extreme weather?
Well, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Copenhagen is Kaare Sandholt, International Chief Expert of the Energy Transition Programme at the China Energy Research Institute. The institute is affiliated with China's National Development Reform Commission. In Cambridge, in the UK, we have Matthew Agarwala. He is a climate economist at the Bennett Institute for Public Policy. That's at Cambridge University. And I'm delighted to say that here with me in the studio is the British TV weather presenter, Nazaneen Ghaffar. You're all very welcome to Roundtable. Nazaneen, I'll come to you first of all. We've just had the wettest 18 months in Britain since they began keeping records in, 1836. Is this what we can now expect? Very, very wet winters?
It's looking more and more likely as the global temperature rises, yes, because for every degree that we see the global temperature rise, the atmosphere can hold approximately 7% more moisture. So that does mean more rainfall, more severe storms are likely. Now, the World Weather Attribution Study looked at the period from October 2023 to March just gone, and it's quite frightening what they found out. Now, what they did, they compared it with pre-industrial levels compared to now, where we've got a global temperature of around 1.2 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial climate. And what it found was, in pre-industrial times, storms as severe, as intense as the period between October to March probably happened once every 50 years. So twice in a century, right? Now they are happening 1 in every 5 years. So around 20 times in every 100 years or so. That is incredibly worrying. And on top of that, if the global temperature rises up to 2 degrees Celsius, it will be 1 in every 3 years. And we're only 0.8 degrees away from that. So really quite worrying findings from that. And it's not even the October to March period we need to be worried about, really, because even looking at our springs and summers, they are also turning incredibly wet. With the higher temperatures, we are seeing severe thunderstorms. We take a look at April just gone. That was the 6th wettest, I believe, on record since records began. As you mentioned, 1836, since those records began, the 6th wettest. And May, even so far this week, some parts of the north and west of the UK had over a month's worth of rainfall in just 24 hours. It's really incredibly worrying.
Cora, nobody can deny climate change is happening when we hear statistics like Nazaneen has just provided us with. How is Europe doing then in terms of the fight back, controlling emissions and actually providing leadership on this?
Yeah, I think that from a European perspective, Europe is doing a lot of good stuff in order to control emissions. But unfortunately, if we look at the global scale, we still see that the global CO2 emission is rising. And this must change very rapidly in order to control the climate change.
So there's no denying that our weather patterns in Europe have now changed as a result of all of these emissions being pumped out. I mean, we see some political leaders who won't even acknowledge that climate change is real. This, you're telling us, it absolutely is happening.
It's definitely happening, and I doubt that anyone sincerely would doubt that climate change is happening, and it is serious. It's getting rapidly worse, and we really need to very quickly reduce CO2 emissions, both on a European scale, but definitely on a global scale. And I'm working with China. China is the biggest polluter regarding CO2 emission. But China is also taking this extremely seriously and have clear plans for being carbon neutral before 2060.
Matthew, you're in Cambridge at the university. Your country is going to have an election, we now know, on July the 4th. It's very interesting, isn't it, that in all the talk about politics and policies, climate change and green policies never ever seem to be number one, not even in the top 5 of people's priorities.
Well, I think that's changing, and changing quite rapidly. The more frequently we face these intense storms, the higher up the political agenda this seems to rise. And in fact, the UK has been on the right side of this for quite some time. We've been one of the most successful economies in terms of decreasing not just the carbon intensity of our economy, but also the overall emissions. UK emissions are down about 53% since 1990, down about 5% in just the past year. That's great news, but the challenge is that backsliding due to the cowardice of political leaders who are unwilling to make the upfront costs to invest in further decarbonization, that can be really problematic. And we've seen the UK rolling back important environmental legislation. If that continues, we'll lose that prime spot as one of the world leaders on decarbonization.
Matthew, how would you describe that phrase you just used, carbon intensity, in terms of emissions? How does that play out? What does it really mean?
So, yeah, there are 2 ways that economists think about carbon emissions and economics. The first is what we call the carbon intensity. How much carbon do we emit for every dollar of output that we generate? And one of the things that we want to do is reduce the carbon intensity. So less carbon for more dollars of output. That's a good strategy. We want to pursue that. The problem is, though, as economies grow, even if we are reducing the intensity of carbon in our output, if we're growing output even faster, then emissions overall can still rise. The UK has been doing fairly well, and many of the developed economies have been doing quite well in reducing the intensity. And in fact, we're quite pleased to say now that emissions across Europe seem to be flatlining and even falling. In 2023, EU emissions fell by about 15%, largely due to changes in the generation of electricity away from some of the fossil fuels towards more renewables. And the projections now are that by 2040, we might see an 88% reduction in EU emissions compared to 1990. That's because of a whole host of policies, including the emissions trading scheme, but also vehicle efficiency standards, insulation in homes, changing the technology mix for generating energy and electricity. So there's a whole host of policies that need to come online here.
Naz, I want to take a look at some data we have from the UK Met Office. So last winter was the second wettest on record in the UK. And if we take a closer look at how climate change is affecting the UK, the top 10 warmest winters on record in the UK included 2024, 22, 20, 2016 and 2014. And then the top 10 wettest also included 2024, last year, 2020, 2016 and 2014. So are we getting to the stage now where winter is just going to be super wet and warmer than we've previously had?
Well, yes, like I just said, that it looks like 1 in every 5 years currently we could see very wet and mild with that as well, winter periods. And this is not great news for UK farming and agriculture in particular. This period of autumn and winter that we've just had, a lot of farmers reported only getting half of their crops because the soil was so waterlogged. And it wasn't just the intensity of those storms and the number of them, it was also the amount of time in between them was very little. So there was no time for the soil to even recover, to dry up before the next storm came along. So nothing could be planted, no crop was able to be produced. But as I said previously, it's not just autumn and winter we need to worry about. It's spring and summer as well. They are becoming wet. They're becoming notoriously hot as well. It's not long ago we reached over 40 degrees Celsius. I mean, that's unheard of. So I think things like that are likely to happen more often. And with higher temperatures, you're likely to have a breakdown of that heat with severe thunderstorms, which in urbanised areas such as cities like London, that means surface water flooding because their surfaces are concrete. They're not able to absorb that water. So as a result, like we found in the summer of 2021, we had extreme flooding of many places having to be evacuated, such as wards in hospitals, tube stations were overflowed, dozens of them with water. And this is not a great situation. There are some ideas on how this could be avoided by adapting, but whether we should be adapting or really sorting out this situation and stopping the global temperature rising is the question.
Naz, you mentioned the impact on the farming community across the UK. Colin Chappell is a fourth-generation farmer on the banks of the River Anchome in Lincolnshire. He produces food including peas, oil and wheat. And this is what he has to say. There are some farms in the valley that will not see a harvest at all this year. That hasn't happened since 1948. And he believes the future for many farmers in Britain is very bleak. Cora, are you seeing similar kind of things play out in Denmark in terms of weather patterns and the farming community not being able to plant crops?
Yes, this year is not so seriously as last year, but I just came back from Italy a week ago, and the farmers in Italy and Sicily told me that this last year was the worst year for olive oil production, mainly due to drought, extreme hot weather and no rain for a long period. So I think it's a combination, as mentioned, of extreme rain, but also periods with extreme heat and no rain. So this is really a very bad situation for farmers all over Europe, I think.
Matthew, are we about to pay the price of years of lack of leadership when this issue was not on the table, it was not a priority for governments, and now all of a sudden this has got very, very real?
I think people are already paying the price. We have seen catastrophic storms all around the world. Most recently in Brazil, a few weeks ago in Dubai, they had a year's worth of rain in a day. We saw last year loss of life in Europe because of storms. We saw just a couple of years ago people dying in Texas, the warmest state or one of the warmest states in one of the richest countries on the planet, because it got so cold and the infrastructure wasn't ready for it. People are already paying the price, but this is really just the appetizer course. The extreme highs in temperature, the extreme wet, the extremeness of the storms, and the extreme lows in temperatures that we're finding as well have a direct impact on labor productivity. Now, why do I care about labor productivity? Well, because that's what determines increases in wages for regular households all across the world. And when we start seeing people exhausted because of the extreme temperatures after lunch, we see a reduction in their productivity in the workforce. We see a reduction in output. That means there's a reduction in taxes, in tax receipts for the government. So there's less money to pay for public services, and it has a knock-on effect. So really, there are two kinds of climate costs. One is the upfront investment cost in decarbonizing transport, food, electricity, and heating in buildings. And then there's the other kind of cost, which is the human toll, the loss of life, the loss of productivity, the cleanup costs after extreme events. Now, one of these, the investments, will give us clean, green, efficient infrastructure and energy for years to come. The other kind of cost, the human toll, the lost productivity, there's nothing but downside. There's no question we're going to pay for climate change. The only question is whether we pay for the design to deliver a clean, green economy, or pay for the disasters that we face if we fail to do it the right way around.
Kaare, who's providing the best leadership in Europe on this issue, do you think? Which countries?
Yeah, I won't name one country. I actually think there's a good momentum currently. If you look at Denmark, we have a lot of wind energy. Around 60% of our electricity consumption would covered by wind. If you look at Germany, you see an extreme quickly transformation from coal to wind and solar. So I think a lot of European countries currently is not only caring about the climate, but also investing in the energy transformation, especially in the power sector. And if you look at the costs, I think one of the exceptional good news is that wind and solar now is the cheapest solution for producing electricity globally. Also in China, where coal power is cheap, building new solar power compared with new coal power is already on an equal basis today, and in the future, solar and wind will definitely be cheaper. So there are good development trends also on a global scale. The question is that too slow? Who is actually trying to delay this transformation, and who is pushing for a quicker transformation? This is the real question to be concerned about.
Naz, you mentioned a really scary stat earlier on about the day it hit 40 Celsius in London. I was actually at London Heathrow that day, and it was unbreathable. It was absolutely terrible. I'm sure you remember it, July 2022. Are we going to see more summers like that in cities like London? Because let's be frank, in the 80s and 90s, these were temperatures you just could never have imagined happening.
Absolutely. In the 80s and 90s, you probably wouldn't have even imagined above 35 degrees Celsius, and that quickly happened. Yes, I think so. It's going to be more of a frequent thing, but it's not just hitting that temperature mark, it's the prolonged dryness, which is another massive issue, as mentioned as well. So yes, we will have thundery breakdowns with intense amounts of rainfall, but the prolonged dryness means that very dry ground means wildfires are more likely to happen, because that's one of the things that's needed to fuel a wildfire. Dry ground with that's going to cause a massive issue, as we found during that year where we hit the 40 degrees Celsius mark. Parts of the UK, around many areas of Europe, were out of control, as well as the US, with wildfires, and that could be another damaging thing when it comes to farming and agriculture as well. So really, it is quite frightening what's happening. Hotter summers, longer drier periods, wetter winters and milder ones as well. So make of that what you will.
Matthew, European Parliament elections coming up in June. Again, there will be politicians talking about migration, immigration, crime, border security. green policies aren't vote winners, are they? Let's be frank.
Well, that's something that the politicians are going to have to design their case and make their case to the people that it is worth investing in our future. A politician who tells me it's not worth investing in our own future, that we shouldn't be thinking about a livable planet, that we shouldn't be pursuing the low carbon, climate resilient infrastructure that gives us cheaper transport, cleaner air, healthier people, more productive labor forces. If you want to argue against all of those things as a politician, then go ahead. But there is no escaping the reality. The science is unambiguous. Climate change is happening. It is driven largely by man-made activities. We have the technologies to address it and to turn this ship around. We just need the political leadership in order to deliver that.
Kaare, talking of technology that's coming, e-vehicles, very, very popular now, quite expensive. You're working closely with the Chinese government. They have huge ambitions to expand into Europe with their own EVs. Is that something you think will take precedence in the next few years?
Yeah, China for many years had huge ambitions on being innovative on green technologies in general. And that goes for EVs, that goes for batteries, that goes for solar power, that goes for wind power. I think they have succeeded mainly due to their home market. Around 90% of the EVs produced in China is used in China, so it's only a small portion. The question is for Europe is that the Chinese EV cars, are they cheaper, better, higher quality than the European cars? So the European car industry has to step up to the Chinese development in order to compete. But clearly, I see as a general trend, both in Europe and certainly in China, EVs will take over the individual transport and also along the way, the heavy transport. And in our scenarios for the future development in China, we expect around 400, 500 million EV cars around 2050.
What does that mean for Europe, Matthew, if all these Chinese EVs come into the European market where, let's face it, the Chinese vehicles, whether they're better or not, they're certainly cheaper?
Well, the trade economist in me is torn here because on the one hand, it's great to have lower price, lower cost EVs. On the other hand, Europe and North America have already lost on solar PV to China because China provided substantial state aid in developing those technologies and we can no longer compete. China is doing the same now with electric vehicles, and Europe and the United States are facing a critical decision point. If they don't compete on green industrial policy with China, then we will lose the EV market, possibly forever, to China as well. So what we saw just a couple of weeks ago is the Biden-Harris administration in the United States introducing an extension and an increase of tariffs on Chinese exports, 100% tariffs now on Chinese EVs, increased tariffs on aluminum, steel, semiconductors, healthcare products, and a whole host of other exports. There is a concern on the trade policy side that China may be practicing or engaging in dumping practices, providing so much subsidy funded by government debt to domestic production that Chinese producers can export below cost of production to other countries. And we did see about a 72, 73% increase in China's exports of EVs in just the past year. That's a pretty substantial jump. The way that Europe and the United States can address this is with tariffs or with their own state-funded subsidies of their own.
Naz, I just want to come back to the weather. One final point. In England, we've always had 4 seasons. It feels lately, last couple of years, that we just go from winter straight into summer. Spring has been skipped out. Autumn has kind of vanished. Is that the future?
It seems like that's the trend of what's happening. We're not going to not see cold winter but not as frequently. So milder and wetter is looking like the trend at the moment with the rise in the global temperature. And yet springs and summers are looking to also start off quite wet and starting to dry up later in the season and perhaps becoming more prolonged into the later part of summer, into the early part of autumn. That's the shift that currently seems to be happening. Whether that continues that way, it's not going to be every single year. Some years that it will still be very cold winters.
Cora, thank you so much. And to Matthew and Nazaneen as well, the clock has beaten us. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just search for Roundtable TRT World. And if you like what you see there, please do hit that subscribe button. But for now, from me and Brady and all of the team here, goodbye and thank you for watching.